Hello and welcome to another episode of Album Musings. So in this week's episode I'm going to be taking a look at the fifth studio album by Status Quo. The album's Piledriver, and we'll get on and have a look in a moment at the various chart statistics and a few other things around the band at that time and beyond. But before we do that, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping as we're getting to the end of the year. So for next week's episode, which this is going out on the 14th of December 2022, so next week, which is the 21st, I'm going to be putting out my customary Yuletide video, the 21st of December being the shortest day. And as has become the tradition for the last couple of years, I think, that's going to be a land artwork video for Magic the Gathering, and I'll call it Land Ahoy. So that's going to be the third one. So I'll be picking up where I left off in the previous year's episode, and we'll just go through some land for half an hour or so, actually on camera, and do that. And then the very last episode of Album Musings for 2022 will be on the 28th of December, and that is going to be featuring The Chronic by Dr. Dre. So this week's album, Piledriver, is 50 years old on the 15th of December 1972. And the Dr. Dre album came out on the 15th of December, but 1992. So a little bit newer, only 30 years old. And that leads me on to another thing. So as we get into 93, obviously I'm going to be featuring albums from 73, 83, 93 and 2003. And looking at the albums that are coming out and the time frame, I suspect the episodes are going to be slightly more biased towards 93, just because that was a really interesting period for me in terms of the sort of music I pivoted towards, and generally just what was going on in my life in that time. So it makes some interesting stories to spin around the episodes. However, what I'd like to do is just ask the viewers of this series, is there any particular one of those decades, 73, 83, or 2003, that you'd like me to feature, albums from those years, that you have a preference for, outside the fact that the series is going to be slightly biased towards 1993. That's not to say every single album episode I do in the year is going to be from 1993, but there's going to be a strong bias monthly towards that, based on what comes out each month. So yeah, just think about that, and if there is a particular year outside of 93 you'd like me to feature albums from, so I can get a rough idea what I want to do when I'm not doing 1993, just note it in the comments section. So back to the album in hand, which is Piledriver by Status Quo. So released, as I've said, on 15th of December 1972. Genre's hard rock, and this was, a reasonable amount of time into their career, and we'll have a look how far they were in a moment. It was the first to be produced by the group themselves, and the first on the Vertigo label, so they'd switched labels at that point. It peaked at number 5 in the UK and included several favourites that would be featured frequently in live concerts. Now, there was actually only one single off of this that was released in the UK. There were 2 singles, but the second one was a US only release, and so I won't be featuring that so much in this episode because it didn't make the UK charts. So yeah, as we say here, first one the group recorded after they had switched labels from Pi to Vertigo Records. And if you're familiar with Status Quo, it'd probably be no surprise that they like to record at high volumes. So apparently when they were recording for Pi, the studio staff had complained about the volume as it would overload the input levels on the recording desk and distort. But for Piledriver, I'm assuming because of just the facilities that were available to them through recording with Vertigo at the IBC studios, Portland Place in London, they were actually able to bring their touring gear into the studios and record live at stage levels. And yeah, that gave them a much stronger sound. So just looking at their discography and where this slides in, so Status Quo had been releasing albums since 1968. A nice thing to do on YouTube is to go and see if you can track down some of those early performances on UK TV of the really early stuff. The band then were quite psychedelic, and they had a completely different sort of dress code than the sort of denim clad look that they had from sort of this period onwards. Yeah, quite interesting to track down. I think the main single off of that first album would have been, yeah, Pictures of Matchstick Men. So here's 72, this is the album I'm going to do today. And for me, I was most familiar with Status Quo from this period onwards up until really Whatever You Want. I lost interest after here. Somewhere around here I bought the 12 Gold Bars compilation album. But all through this period they were all over the UK singles charts, and we'll be looking at how, you know, to what degree as we go through this episode. So back to Piledriver itself, 8 tracks. And I think, as it says on the original article at the top here, a lot of these were featured in their live set over a great number of years. And you'll see as well with the reissues, as we often see with modern reissues now, they're starting to feature a lot of live appearances. So these would have been a live recording of the band around 73, so the year after this came out. But also the band were playing on shows like BBC Sounds of the 70s, so there was a BBC session around the time of 72, which is when this album came out, which is included on the 2014 CD version. But it's an original form. It was basically an 8-track 8 tracks on the album. Yeah, I like the cover, as they say here. Front cover showed a live shot of the band in their classic heads down, no nonsense boogie mode, which is what they sort of became known for. Sort of boogie shuffle sound. Also in this period, we have the classic Quo lineup. I suppose a lot of people think of it that way, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Quo lineups over the year at the end of this video. So yeah, Francis Rossi, Rick Parfitt, Alan Lancaster and John Coughlan. So that was the Status Quo of the 70s. And then charts and certifications. You can see at this point in their career, not really making inroads into the US charts. And this is mainly, European and Australia. It did go gold in the UK. And also platinum in Australia. But again, as I've pointed out multiple times now, you can see there's quite a big difference in certification cut-off as well. And also the way in which those figures are sometimes calculated. So let's have a look at Album of the Year, just to give us some sort of placement in terms of, again, an aggregate website. So you're going to get different results when you go to different websites that do this sort of meta-analysis of popularity based on various charts and critics and user results. And this is the order they place that in. So yeah, a lot of their early stuff here. And there's 12 gold bars. But we'll be revisiting their albums later on, generally, in a bit more detail. So here's their album chart success for the band on the UK charts. And so you can see for the first album that got into the charts, I'm just going to go back up here actually, because this gives a real good indication of why Status Quo were really part of the UK sort of national psyche at the time. They had 4 UK #1 albums, but the albums and the singles regularly got in the top 10, particularly during the 70s. And at the end of the video, I'm going to go through a bit the singles aspect of the band, because it's really fascinating to me anyway. So you can see 73 was in Piledriver, hit the charts, so released in 72, hit the charts in, was it January of 73, got up to number 5, 38 weeks on the charts, no weeks on #1. So the first album to get to #1 was on the level in 75. And you can see here Blue for You in 76. So from really this point onwards, if we ignore the greatest hits, you can see, and also you notice they switched to the Vertigo label, so you're getting these Pi, their earlier label, sort of cash-ins. So this Best of Status Quo on Pi would have been the best of earlier albums by the band. And the same here. So they're desperately trying to cash in on that success. So let's just ignore those for the moment and look at all the studio albums. Number 5, #1, number 2, #1, #1 again. Live album number 3, Rocking All Over the World, 5, 3, 3, 3. This is their sort of big compilation album that I suppose mostly covers that, the classic Quo period from Piledriver onwards up to Whatever You Want. And I suppose this is where I sort of started to lose interest, and they were still getting into quite high into the album charts, well into the mid-80s. And what was interesting is you can see certain of their albums after that do get in quite high, but quite a lot of them are compilation albums. So Piledriver, after it was released on the 15th of December 72, got onto the charts on the 20th of 1st 73. Highest position was number 5, and you can see it also re-entered the charts on several occasions and just even in 2014 it got on to number 90. Now, looking at the chart stats here, I suspect that it wasn't until later that the UK charts were doing like a top 100. But yeah, various re-entries over the years there mainly during the 70s, as you can see. Yeah, 2 weeks in the top 10, 14 weeks in the top 20, 25 weeks in the top 40, and that's when they do the top 40 rundown in the UK. For the singles charts, it would always cover the top 40. I'm trying to even remember if they even did an album chart rundown. So this is the week that it went to number 5, or went up to number 5. And in fact, there's at least one album we've spoken about before, which was No Secrets by Carly Simon. I covered that in a previous episode. So that's in the charts. And a few other albums that I seem to mention week in, week out, when I'm talking about 72 generally. And stuff that's always floating around, like Slade and Heartbreaker by Free. Although they had a lot of success earlier in their career, in the early 70s, like 71, 72, this in some ways was a bit of a return to form. 73, we've got Cat Stevens, Catch Bullet 4, Who Do You Think We Are by Deep Purple. We're talking about Deep Purple last week. Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. Talking Book by Stevie Wonder. And so on. So let's look at that first and only single in the UK. So Paper Plane, released on the 10th of November 72, so a month before the album, got to number 8 on the UK singles charts. Was obviously on the album Piledriver, and it was recorded again for their acoustic album Stripped Bare. But it's a sort of song that cropped up live an awful lot for the band. One of many, and it's also on the 12 Gold Bars, from what I remember. It's been a while since I've dug that album out. So, chart-wise, let's have a look and see where Paper Plane got to. So there it is. So you can see sort of slow run up the chart up to number 8 and then back out again. Top 10 for 2 weeks, top 20 for 5 weeks, top 40 for 9 weeks, and 11 weeks on the chart. At the point it was in, that would have been a maximum of a top 75. And as always, we'll take a look and see what else was in the chart the week it was in its highest position. So Blockbuster by The Sweet, You're So Vain, Carly Simon, Wishing Well by Free. That was off of where was it? Yeah, this album. Sylvia by Focus, there's Paper Plane, Roll Over Beethoven by Electric Light Orchestra, Jean Genie, Whiskey in the Jar by Thin Lizzy. That was off a really early album. Always on My Mind by Elvis Presley, Crazy Horses by the Osmonds. Dave Edmunds, yeah, people forget. So I became probably most familiar with Dave Edmunds when he had a bit of a resurgence during New Wave with songs like Girls Talk, but he's been releasing material for a long time, and he's an incredible guitarist, actually. Desperate Dan by Lieutenant Pigeon. Yeah, it's one of these sort of novelty acts that were around at the time. Oh, Moody Blues, Nights in White Satin. So I mentioned there was another single off of Piledriver, which is Don't Waste My Time. Now, interestingly, if you click on this, the article just brings you back here, so there's no separate article for it. And as we'll see in a moment, we'll get a feel for where subsequent singles featured on the UK charts outside of just the singles off of this album. And so you'll see, like, I wouldn't say much a gap in their releases, but yeah, you can see where that would have slid in had it got on the UK charts. So let's take a look at their singles success over the years. So UK number one singles, they actually had 22 singles in the UK top 10, 57 in the top 40. And to me, this is why they're so ingrained in my musical psyche, because all through the 70s and beyond, but particularly the 70s, they just seem to be on the charts. In the same way that whenever I think of them, I always think of Slade, a similar sort of thing, where you've got a pretty heavy rock band who are having chart success with singles. So let's just look down here, and you can see Paper Plane was off of this album, but there's no Don't Waste My Time here. Hello had Caroline off of it. So we'll just commit that to memory, and then Quo had Break the Rules. And again, look, so this is this point where, they changed labels to Vertigo. So, of course, all the singles before that would be on the Pi label from their other albums. And, they were getting it like this got to number 8, this got to number 7. And then we get to Paper Plane, they switch to Vertigo, number 8. Now you can start to see, but here's this sort of lone Pi release. They obviously must have released an album off of an earlier Status Quo album, which was recorded on that label. And there's Caroline, Break the Rules, Down Down. That was their number one. Roll Over, Lay Down, Rain, Mystery Song didn't do so well. We see all through the 70s here. 9, number 3, again and again. I always thought that actually got into the top 10, but obviously it didn't. 78, Accident Prone, Whatever You Want. Yeah, I remember this being played a ton on the radio. What You're Proposing got to number 2, Living the Line, number 16. And then you can see, various singles in the 80s still managed to get into the top 10. The Quo Army are still buying the releases, as is the general public, I suspect. Sort of people that grew up with Status Quo, that stuck with the band. And there we go, to 2010. Just looking, there doesn't seem to be any like more on here. And I thought it'd be interesting to just look at their sort of career laid out album cover wise on Album of the Year. So again, we're here, and this is the stuff before that, so 4 albums before then. And of course they were slowly getting closer and closer through these albums to the hard rock sound that sort of became their trademark sound for quite a while. And then this is the period really that I remember them most for, and I think it was up until here. So from all through this period up until about here they had the original lineup. So let's look at the lineup, and we're talking about this period here. So here's their first album release on Pi, and we get up to around here, so around like 81, and you can see like, all through this time, same 4 band members: Francis Rossi, Rick Parfitt, Alan Lancaster, and John Coughlan. And that's the sort of status quo I remember. But as with a lot of bands, you have members that joined the band. So this was Alan Lancaster's replacement here, who are actually in the band longer than the band member that often people associate as being classic Quo. And Andy Bown, I think that is, am I saying that right? Yeah, Andy Bown, and actually joined the band as a keyboard player. I suppose he would have been like a touring musician or guest. And has been in the band for an awful long time, from around here. So he was in the band pre-81 when they had decided to add back in keyboards. Although, as you can see here, he's basically a multi-instrumentalist. They have quite a number of different drummers over the years, and you've got the core of Francis Rossi and Rick Parfitt, who have obviously sadly passed away later on here. And so this was interesting. This was a sort of reunion thing they did, the Frantic 4 reunion. So just again to just further cement the perspective here. So this period here, and this is all of these albums. Now you can see the difference between this period and these earlier ones when they were actually recording tracks. So here we've got guitar, bass, drums and keyboard, and it's at this point that Rick Parfitt joins the band. And the difference between here and here is they still had a keyboard player here. And then they go through a period where they got the Frantic 4 lineup. They then introduce a keyboard player. At this point, was actually sort of formally joined the lineup, although as you can see from the previous chart, here, they were in previous to this. So John Coughlan leaving the band occurs between Never Too Late and 1982. And that gives you some idea as well as when the Frantic 4 reunion was. So yeah, he died December 2016. Between these two lineups. And then just to give you a sort of helicopter view of the chart's position in, you know, what I, from my perspective, deem to be the classic period, and you can sort of see, you know, why that I was so aware of them at the time. Just in terms of the albums that were constantly on the charts, so through to around here, and then also the singles from Paper Plane, then Caroline, Down, and so on. So this is just the 60s to 70s section here, and then into 81. And there we go, there's the 2000s. Oh, yeah, that would explain why we didn't see anything on that. Yeah, it did, genuinely, they didn't have any more singles chart success at that point on the UK charts. So there we have it. Another Album Musings episode in the can. I hope you've enjoyed this episode about Piledriver by Status Quo. I certainly, you know, felt that I needed to cover an album by them this year because of this was, to me, such a pivotal album in lots of different ways in terms of sound-wise and, you know, the real ramping up of their chart success. So thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next episode.